I'm going to talk about debugging and specifically sort of REPL-based debugging today. And this has always been a really interesting topic to me because I find there's generally two ways that people do this process, right? So there's the people that come from like C and Java and often from computer science, and they're really used to logging stuff everywhere, right? To figure out what's happening during runtime. And then there's people who come from often dynamic languages that you can just sort of insert essentially a freeze point and execute arbitrary code, and that's a debugger or binding.pry. Before I go on, how many of you who kind of code day to day mostly use logging statements to sort of debug your code as you're running along? So you do puts everywhere or whatever else? Puts? Sometimes? And so the rest of you mostly use something like bybug or pry or whatever? Interesting. All right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, that's me. I skipped this slide because it's just, most of you know at least I'm here. I help organize this group. My name is Riaz. So, like I said, we're going to talk about pry. And for those of you that have not maybe used it before, the way to get it, it's just a gem. You do gem install pry, or if you're in a Rails project, you can include it in your Rails project by just putting the pry gem or the pry Rails gem. It's kind of nice because it makes your default console based on pry. And well, let's say what is pry, right? So pry is a REPL, literally R-E-P-L. Most of you probably know what that acronym means, but for those of you who don't, what the hell is a REPL? This is the first thing I found out because I was using obviously REPLs a long time, but I didn't know what they meant. So obviously it's a replicator, as from Star Trek, or it's a replicant from Blade Runner, but not really anything as cool. It's simply an acronym for read, evaluate, print, loop, right? So if I start up pry. Just running next, I get a sort of Ruby command line and I can just run code, right? Well, literally that is the code, this. Like you can write your REPL here, which is over and over and over the loop word, right? To evaluate something, I don't know if I'm doing this right sequence, but essentially on the right side, right, you're going to read whatever was typed in, evaluate it, and then put it back on the screen. If that's in sequence. So it's like, you type something on the command line, you evaluate it, run it basically, and then put whatever the result is and then start over. Like that one line of code is a REPL. So obviously you can say, well, IRB is also a REPL. Most of you who've ever done Ruby programming have seen that, where you just have Ruby installed, you type IRB, and you get this sort of little thing on your command line, and you can run it. So why are we even talking about pry, right? Well, let's move back a second. So REPLs are supremely important. They're in most languages, or in a decent number of languages. It's harder to do in compiled languages because you compile the code ahead of time, right? But there are ways in some things like Java. But otherwise, Python, Node, your browser console, that's a REPL. But we're talking about Ruby, right? So the reason I like pry as my sort of favorite REPL in Ruby is because it's awesome, right? It adds, as a sort of a litany of stuff, it adds all these extra features to what is the standard IRB-based REPL. And we're going to talk more detail about that. And like Ruby 2.4 has IRB sort of built in and has some features that are IRB built in, but has more advanced versions of IRB built in. And I think it's really important because of debugging, right? Like that's really the value here, right? Like this is to me what debugging normally feels like most of the time. And we're also going to talk about how pry has some extra tools that are really practically valuable when you're going through this process, which is like 90% of my day, right? So I love that. I love that. Okay, so the one that's most commonly used, that just sort of when you do it for the first time and you didn't know you could do it, you're just like, this is amazing, right? And that's just runtime invocation. You write some code and you try to run it and it crashes or it breaks and you're like, why? And that means one of your assumptions of what's happening in the code is wrong. And the best way oftentimes to understand that is to put a binding.pry near the exception and inspect the state of variables just to make sure they match what you mean. So let's actually do this real quick in a practical sense. So I just have some kind of crappy things, and we're going to just look at the basic use of runtime invocation, and we're going to just look at a couple of cool, nifty features that are added. think I was like messing with this ahead of time. Okay, so let's see. I just wrote this quick little file. You can see it. It doesn't do almost anything. It requires pry. There's a method that by default creates a sort of, I don't know why I put that above, but or it's part of a parameter. But essentially, x is a random number, and then we set add x equals x for really no reason, and then we put all of that, which means we're probably going to put the value of x. Even if you don't understand that, at the end of the day, you're going to see a number on the screen. And for some reason, when I'm running this, let's say that I'm finding I was expecting a different number I don't understand, and imagine this code was much more complicated. I'm going to exit out of this. Where am I? Yeah. Right? So if I didn't have the binding.pry, let me actually first do that one. Yeah. Okay. So if I didn't have this binding.pry, essentially I would see a number on the screen, right? And for some reason, I don't understand why these numbers are randomly different. Like I did something weird in my code I didn't quite understand. So I go and look here, and I do binding.pry. So I magically essentially get something that freezes and tells me where I was, and now I can, for some reason, inspect it, right? And I can keep seeing that the parameter somehow coming in is, at this point, consistent. But if I run it again, I'll see that x is different, right? And this looks really simple, but if you're in a really complex application where a lot of things are going on, it's really hard to drill into the one spot where something is wrong to see what's going on. And here you can kind of stop the universe, look around before it runs through and hits your error. Am I making sense? I know I'm jumping around the command line here with maybe not the most perfect examples. So that's the basic invocation, but there's some really nifty features. So the first one in the top right is called edit. And this is really interesting that I don't find I use practically all the time, but so if I'm here, right, I can call edit, which is sort of magically inserted by pry, and I can edit a method, which is the method name of the method. And now I've opened up Vim to actually edit the source of the file that I was literally running. Now I don't think it actually changes the version of it at runtime, but if I'm sort of like, I'm in some deeply nested version part of the code where I don't quite know how to find that file in my editor really easily, and it's a really quick fix, I can just call edit, make the quick fix, and then jump back out, and now I'd have to go back to my editor to go discover like where that file was, right? It can be convenient sometimes. So play, this is one of my favorites. So sometimes I know that, let's say that on line 5, I keep seeing an exception, right? It's not in this case, but there's always something thrown. And I kind of want to see what's going to go on, or I want to execute some lines ahead of me that are further down the stack. I call play -l and then a number, and it'll find line 5 and run it. So it's actually now running line 5. And oftentimes I find I have an error in some case, and I put a binding.pry, maybe, and I find, oh, everything's fine here, but maybe something has gone wrong a couple lines of execution down, right? So rather than moving where my pry is or having to type out the code that's in the subsequent line, I just call play L and the number of the next line, and it just runs for me really conveniently so I can keep even seeing where the error is happening. Just additional tools to help you kind of play around with executing things at runtime. Oh, where am I? So especially in Rails, you will sometimes find you do a bunch of stuff, or you put something out and you're like, sort of, you don't even know where the code was that your binding.pry was. So you can run where am I, and it just comes back to you, oh, you were here. This is where the binding.pry was. So this happens to me all the time as well. So those are some of the ones that I think, especially where am I in play, that I use all the time. And I didn't even know about them until I started thinking about doing this presentation. I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. I should start using this. So let's look at a couple others that are commonly used. ls. This one's awesome. So ls is, because Ruby is sort of dynamic, at runtimes there will often be methods on objects that are added, right? Especially active record. And so you're like, what can I do to this object? Or I get back an object from some gem, and I'm like, what are the methods available to me here to do stuff? So you do ls, which is just like the bash ls to list files, but instead you're going to call it on something else, like an x in this case, right? So this literally tells me what are the things I can call on x. And you can do this at runtime on anything. So how many of you have used ls before? I'm here. All the time. CD is the next one I was going to show. Yeah. So I'm actually going to, for the rest of this, I'm going to jump over to a different file. So this file, again, pretty simple. There's just two classes. There's a line item class. But just think of the constructs of what they're meant to do. An order has multiple line items, right? So it has, orders can be initiated. It has an array of line items, as you can see here. And then you can add a line item. And then you can total by taking your line items, iterating over them, and getting your, a total. And the line item is essentially an object that just has two values stored in it. You don't have to remember all of that. So if I come here and imagine you could literally be in Rails somewhere where an order or is an active record object or something that comes back from a gem or from a service, whatever it is, and you're like, what the hell can order do, right? So you can do ls order and you'll get sort of like, oh, you can add a line item to it. Oh, you can total it, right? Without having to go back and look at the source code. All right, so CD. CD is just like in Bash where you can move the context of, or the frame of reference of where functions are called. So for right now, if I wanted to add a line item, I would do order.add line item, right? However, if I want to kind of further explore the internals of order, I can CD order. And now, instead of calling like order.add line item, I would just call add line item, right? Like now, self is the order. I have now like moved the vision of the world, of the pry, for like somehow being inside that. And that can be really helpful if you have really complex objects and you're constantly like blah, 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 dot something, blah, 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 dot something. You can just jump inside. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I actually have CDs in Thomas, but for some reason I never actually needed to. But once you see a new object, you actually have access to private methods, don't you? I'm trying to remember.
I don't know. We could experiment with that. I mean, I don't really think about that much because I don't really ever try to violate that. And even if you were outside, there's still ways of calling private methods on another object in Ruby because can't you just literally send the symbol? Yeah? Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Like, I usually would just send, but I didn't think like, oh, if I wanted to, maybe that's...
I guess you could. Yeah.
I think I've done that. If not, I would be surprised, but I want to say yes.
Well, maybe we should just try that. Like if we just did, I can't type live.
Hello, world.
Boots. Do I have a double? Do I? I do. Whoa, what just happened? Yeah. And then the method was called what? Just hello world? Yeah, it works. You can just call private methods that way. See? Learn something every day. Or learn something new every day. So the next one, so we just looked at CD. I wanted to show you show doc. That can be helpful sometimes. So for example, let's say I just have x equals some string, right? I can, and for some reason, I know someone's told me about chomp, and I don't quite understand what it does. So I can do show doc x dot chomp. So this will be available not on everything, but most common things in Ruby, rather than having to go look up docs some places, you can actually sometimes find the docs easily by just doing show-doc on a method, and it'll, especially if it's things that are part of Ruby, will come up with the documentation. You're like, oh, that's what it does. So another one is show source right here. This is more commonly useful. Like I often do find myself sort of in one land and I'm calling a method somewhere and I'm like, I gotta go jump back to my editor to go look at the source of that method to figure out what it does. So if I call where am I am inside order. Okay, where am I? All right, so I'm here and I want to see the source of order, right? So I can do show source order and it literally shows me, oh, here's the source code for order. You can even do that on methods to be like, I'm calling some method. Where is this from? Where is it going? Like, what does it actually do? And I can quickly just call show source, for example, order.add line item. Oh, great, it adds a line item. Right? It's just a very quick, easy to go see what's happening in the source code. And so there's, pry really helps you sort of bridge the gap between sort of like the one lane, which is you're generating your code, and the other lane where you're executing it. And then there's often I'm just constantly jumping back and forth, right? And sometimes it's easier just to be inside the sort of debugging world and not have to jump out when you're looking at things like your source code. Oh, WTF, that's great. So imagine some error is raised, right? And I'm like, what the hell happened? Well, you can call WTF, and it will kind of show you the last exception that was run and show you the stack trace of that. And I think you can do WTF with increasing numbers of exclamation marks, and it'll continue to go back and show you more and more of the stack trace, which can sometimes be useful in the Rails because oftentimes your stack traces can, in reality, be very long, and you may actually care about some part of that. But I actually don't find myself using that in reality that often. Maybe some other people do. Dot commands. This is actually very useful sometimes. So like I had a project once where I was doing a lot of file processing and there'd be files on the disk, so sometimes I'd have to go be like, oh, this broke because the file didn't literally exist or it was blank or something else. Well, if you take anything and you just start with dot, just plain dot, then anything after that will actually execute in bash. So if I do like .ls, it is literally running the bash ls command and telling me what files are in this directory. If you were using git and for some reason you really wanted to do git status, you could inside here and actually see the output of git status from inside your debugging terminal. So oftentimes if you are doing things that are sort of, kind of run into the land of, well, what's happening in my file system and something's broken, you can use dot commands to really easily debug that. It's also very helpful when you're debugging things remotely sometimes, and if you're somehow on like a, yeah. For some reason, if you're like, something's broken in my build process, and now you can do, I think, like Heroku run bash, but there's a time when you couldn't do that, and you could still go in and like run Rails console with pry, and then go and look at the state of the file system very easily. So these are all tools. Oh, another one that happens to me all the time is I will just experimentally do something. So like I have this thing, right? AB, and I'm like, oh, great. And I'm like, I want to now use that for something else. I'm like, oh, crap, I forgot to assign it to a variable, right? So like I don't have access to it anymore. Well, underscore is automatically the last thing that was returned. So like if I have something, imagine this object was really complex, and I'm like, oh, I want to do something with it now, you can do like, x equals underscore, and now x equals the last thing that was there. This really commonly happens to me when I open up a Rails console and I'm just like, let me see my first order and see if something's weird about it. And I'm like, oh, yeah, now let me just, now we want to do something on it. And I'm like, oh, crap, I've just been doing order.first to quickly look at an order. And I'd rather now, like, I can do, like, something equals underscore and grab that object to continue. Yeah, so am I going too fast? I'm trying not to take up too much time and to show you some of the things that maybe you don't remember, but these are all heavily detailed in the pry wiki. And there's a huge amount of documentation about it. I'm not going to show these, but there's ways for you to actually like write methods, and you can look back at sort of your history and find methods, like literally grep methods on an object. If you have an active record object with hundreds of methods, you can do ls with hyphen, I think, grep, and you can literally find a specific method. All sorts of weird stuff that can be helpful during debugging. All right, so some extra stuff on top of that. There's a couple of supplementary gems that I find very useful. Pry inline is great. And I will just pull up a quick website to show you. So if you already use pry, so if you ever use like Chrome, sometimes next to where there's like, if you do a debugger or you pause and there's other statements above that, it'll just right there tell you like what those things are in sort of the code. Well, this is similar. If you can see here, they put a binding.pry here, and it's gone ahead and evaluated what @title, @user, and @users is, and just tells you in a comment next to it what that looks like. Yeah. So you don't even have to like pause here and be like, what is that title? What is that user? You know, if at user was nil and that's why you're getting an error, which I guess you would have the error here on line 52, but sometimes you'll find that you're like, oh, this is nil. It's clearly not supposed to be nil, and you'll see that without having to necessarily know to ask to look for it, right? To try to execute and see what it looks like. There's pry bybug. Bybug is another sort of really popular debugging tool. Its benefit is that you get to do like next, step over, all that kind of stuff you can often do in other languages. And pry bybug merges the two and lets you do a lot of the same stuff in sort of a combined way, and you get the best of both worlds. Pry remote is amazing. So if you've ever managed remote servers and you have something that only happens in your server environment that doesn't happen locally, you can maybe set up another server that you're just using for yourself that still shows the same issue, and you can literally call, instead of binding.pry, you call binding.pry remote pry, and it will freeze execution, and then you can SSH on from another console, call pry remote, and then you will like grab you'll grab its session. So normally if you're on your own machine, if binding.pry hits a freeze point, it shows up in your server, like, or whatever you're running in your process. If for some reason you don't have access to where Rails server was invoked essentially, or Rail or background worker, you can use pry remote to essentially still freeze execution and be like, start up a different terminal, a different machine on the same machine, and it'll like sort of connect over to the process that's maybe kicked off by some job management system on Ubuntu or whatever. Yeah, so also I may say, you'd be very careful with these things, so you never want to leave that code in permanently and commit it, because then your like code will just freeze all the time and you'll be like, why does my system never work? Because it will literally do that and when it's running in production and just sit there.
Not to mention, I work in the security space.
Yeah.
Doing remote debugging in a production application is a really great way to find a new job.
Yeah.
Or maybe not to find it, but like
Yeah.
sometimes the security guys that will catch that don't have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
You might actually cause the problem.
I highly recommend, which we did, we wrote a Git hook that actually looks for binding.pry as any new lines that are being committed and stops us. And console.log, yeah, and catches those. Yeah, there is. We use overcommit, which I think sort of wraps all that stuff. But yeah, that's absolutely true. The final thing I'll recommend is there's a talk by one of the guys who's a core contributor. His name is Conrad Irvin. He gave a talk on RubyConf 2013 that was about Repl-based like way of writing your code, like literally using that as a way. Like he actually goes in and like, oh, I want to do something, and he literally calls the edit thing to write the code and then source that file and then execute it. So he goes through his entire development process of writing code dynamically as he's going along. And it's a super fascinating talk just to kind of jar your mind to thinking a different way. All right, so the final thing, I threw a lot of stuff at you. If you haven't used it before, you may not remember it. When lost, ask for help. If you don't know what you're doing, you just say help, and it will tell you, here's all the stuff you can do in a really nice sort of convenient way. And there's, as you can see, tons of stuff that I'm not even talking about. Like hell, you can correct the indentation of things that are in your input buffer, which is code you're writing dynamically. It will fix indentation for you. It's insane. I don't know when they got time to do all this. So that's the end of my talk. That's it. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
This video has been sponsored by Rieta Incorporated. Learn more today at rietta.com.